The rain fell in a slow, mournful rhythm against the large gallery windows, painting grey streaks on the glass that mirrored the ache in Elena's heart. Inside, the world was hushed, filled with the faint, clean scent of oil paint and polished wood floors. She stood before her creation, a portrait so lifelike it seemed to breathe in the quiet room. Her hands, stained with flecks of cerulean blue and burnt sienna, were clasped tightly in front of her, a nervous habit she'd never managed to break. Every person who walked past the canvas offered a polite, distant admiration, but their eyes never saw what she saw. They saw a skillfully painted face of a young boy. She saw a ghost, a memory, a desperate prayer rendered in pigment and hope. This gallery, with its stark white walls, was meant to be a final resting place for her grief, but it felt more like a waiting room for a verdict she wasn't ready to hear. The boy in the portrait gazed out with eyes that held a universe of unspoken stories. Elena had spent weeks capturing that specific shade of hazel, a color she knew better than her own reflection. She had painted the slight upturn of his lips, a hint of a smile that never quite reached its full expression, and the way a single lock of brown hair fell across his forehead. To others, it was a masterpiece of photorealism. For Elena, it was an exorcism. Each brushstroke was a tear she couldn't shed, a conversation she could never have. The canvas had absorbed her sorrow, her longing, and the phantom touch of a small hand she could still feel in hers. It was the face of a stranger she had seen only once, yet it was also the face of the son she had lost, a painful and perfect echo across the years. She remembered the day she saw him, a fleeting moment in a sun-drenched park that now felt like a dream. He was chasing pigeons, his laughter a bright, clear sound that cut through the noise of the city and pierced her soul. It was his profile, the curve of his cheek, the determined set of his small shoulders. It was all so painfully familiar. The vision had struck her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless on the park bench. She had rushed home, not to escape the memory, but to seize it. Her studio became a sanctuary where she fought to bring that vision to life, to prove to herself that she hadn't imagined it. The painting was not a choice. It was a compulsion, a desperate need to understand why the universe would show her a ghost in a playground. A woman with a kind, weary face stepped in from the rain-swept street, her sensible shoes squeaking softly on the floor. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a demanding profession, her eyes methodically scanning the artwork as she made her way through the small gallery. Elena watched her from the corner of her eye, expecting the same brief, appreciative nod before she moved on. But the woman stopped dead in front of her painting. Her shoulders went still, and her head tilted with an expression that was far from simple artistic curiosity. It was a look of profound, heart-stopping recognition, as if she were seeing not a painting, but a person she knew intimately. The air grew thick with an unspoken question, and Elena felt a cold dread mix with a flicker of impossible hope. The stranger took a tentative step closer, her gaze locked on the boy's painted eyes. Her own eyes, a soft, compassionate blue, filled with a deep, unsettling sadness. She wasn't just looking, she was communing with the image, her expression shifting from shock to a tender, heartbreaking sorrow. Elena's own heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was different. This woman saw what she saw. After a long, silent moment that stretched into an eternity, the woman turned away from the canvas, her gaze finally finding Elena's. Her lips parted, and the soft, gentle voice that emerged carried a weight that would change everything. Elena braced herself, completely unaware that this quiet stranger held the missing piece of a puzzle she never even knew she was trying to solve, a truth that would shatter her carefully constructed world. The nurse's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, wrapping around Elena's heart and squeezing the breath from her lungs. He has no family. The phrase echoed in the silent gallery, a cruel and impossible pronouncement that seemed to mock the very canvas it described. Elena felt a dizzying wave of denial wash over her. Her first instinct was to protect her creation, to shield the memory of her son from this stranger's reality. This boy was hers, a phantom born from a fleeting glimpse and a mother's unending grief. He couldn't possibly be real, couldn't be lying in a hospital bed, alone. The gallery, once a sanctuary for her sorrow, suddenly felt like an interrogation room, the stark white walls closing in on her. She wanted to scream that the woman was mistaken, that this was just paint and canvas, not a living, breathing tragedy she was now being asked to witness. A fierce internal battle raged within her. One part of her, the wounded, self-protective part, urged her to retreat. She could thank the nurse for her observation, offer a polite, dismissive smile, and wait for her to leave. She could then lock the door, turn the sign to closed, and retreat into the familiar, manageable pain she had learned to live with. But another voice, a softer, more insistent whisper from deep within her soul, refused to be silenced. It was the voice of a mother who knew the terrifying chill of a hospital room, the profound loneliness of a child's unanswered call. She looked from the nurse's compassionate, waiting eyes to the portrait, and the boy's painted gaze seemed to hold her accountable. Ignoring this felt like a betrayal, not just to the child in the hospital, but to the memory of the son she had loved so fiercely. She understood the cost of stepping forward. To even ask the next question would be to open a door she had sealed shut years ago. It meant voluntarily walking back into the sterile, antiseptic world of medicine, a world that had taken everything from her. The thought of those long, silent corridors, the hushed voices of doctors, and the rhythmic beeping of machines sent a tremor of fear through her. This path promised more pain. It was a direct route back to the heart of her trauma. It would be so much easier, so much safer, to remain in her carefully constructed world where grief had rules and memories could be controlled. To engage with this living boy, to acknowledge his existence, was to risk shattering the fragile piece she had spent years building, one painful brushstroke at a time. The price of empathy felt impossibly steep. Yet, as she looked at the nurse, a woman named Sarah, she saw not a threat, but a reflection of a kindness she herself had once depended on. Sarah's expression was not one of pity, but of profound understanding, as if she could see the invisible scars Elena carried. She waited with a quiet patience that offered space for Elena's turmoil, a silent permission to feel the shock and fear. In that shared moment, something inside Elena broke free. The love she had poured onto that canvas was not a memorial to an ending. It was a living force, a current of energy that had to go somewhere. She realized that turning her back on this child would be to dishonor the very love that inspired the painting. Her art was not a tombstone for her grief, but a bridge to someone else's need. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that felt like her first in years, Elena made her choice. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful sense of purpose. She pushed aside the instinct to flee, to protect her own wounded heart, and instead leaned into the terrifying possibility that this was not a coincidence, but a calling. She met Sarah's gaze, her own eyes now clear with a fragile but firm resolve. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a promise. "What is his name?" With those simple words, Elena stepped across an invisible threshold, leaving the ghost of her past behind to meet a boy who desperately needed the love she still had left to give. The first, most difficult choice had been made. The hospital corridor was a sterile, unforgiving white, a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of her art studio. The air smelled of antiseptic and a faint, underlying scent of illness that made Elena's stomach clench, with memories she had fought for years to suppress. Every squeak of her shoes on the polished linoleum floor echoed the frantic footsteps of her past. Sarah walked beside her, a quiet, reassuring presence in this world of hushed emergencies and controlled sorrow. When they reached the door, Eleanor paused, her hand hovering over the handle, her breath catching in her throat. She was about to cross a threshold into a reality she had only ever painted. Pushing the door open, she saw him. He was small, curled up in a bed that seemed far too large for him, and the sight was a physical blow. The boy from the park, the boy from her canvas, was real, and his aloneness was a palpable force in the quiet room. Leo, as Sarah had called him, was awake, his large, hazel eyes watching her with a weary curiosity that seemed too old for his small face. They were the same eyes she had painstakingly mixed colors to create, yet seeing them in person, filled with a living, breathing soul, was both a miracle and an agony. Words failed her. What could she possibly say? Instead of speaking, Eleanor pulled a small chair to his bedside and took out a simple sketchbook and a piece of charcoal from her bag. Her hands, so accustomed to creating, moved with a gentle certainty. She began to sketch, not him, but a bird in flight, its wings spread wide against an imaginary sky. The only sounds in the room were the soft scratch of charcoal on paper and the rhythmic, gentle beep of a heart monitor. Leo's gaze shifted from her face to her hands, a flicker of interest in his otherwise still expression. Slowly, a fragile bridge of trust was built between them, not with words, but with shared silence and simple creation. After she finished the bird, she drew a cartoonish dog with floppy ears, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched Leo's lips. It was then that he finally spoke, his voice a soft, raspy whisper. He asked her if she could draw a boat, one that could sail on the ocean. Elena's heart ached with a tender, protective warmth as she drew a sturdy little sailboat navigating gentle waves. They began to talk, their conversation drifting through simple topics. His favorite color was the deep blue of the evening sky, and he missed the feeling of running on grass. In this sterile room, surrounded by medical equipment, they created a small, safe world of their own. A momentary escape from the boy's lonely reality and the woman's lingering grief. As she felt more comfortable, Elena gently probed for details about his past, hoping to understand how a child so full of light could end up so alone. She asked him about his home, about his family. Leo's answers were fragmented, like pieces of a broken mirror. He spoke of a lady who sang lullabies and a house with a red door, but he couldn't remember a name or a street. He clutched a small, threadbare teddy bear, its button eyes long gone, as if it were the only solid thing in his shifting memories. The vagueness of his story created a quiet mystery, a sense that his past was a locked room to which he had lost the key. It was clear that he was adrift, a little soul untethered from any anchor, and Elena's desire to protect him intensified into a fierce, maternal resolve. When the visiting hours came to an end, a quiet panic flickered in Leo's eyes. As Elena stood to leave, promising to return the next day, he reached out, and his small, cool fingers wrapped around her wrist. The touch was tentative but firm, a silent plea that resonated deeper than any words could. It was a gesture of pure, desperate connection, and it sealed the bond between them. She gently squeezed his hand, her own eyes filling with tears, on her way out. Sarah stopped her in the hallway, her expression a mixture of gratitude and solemnity. "We found this in his pocket when he was brought in," she said, handing Elena a small, crumpled piece of paper. Elena unfolded it carefully under the harsh fluorescent light. Her breath hitched, and the corridor seemed to tilt as she stared at the faded, delicate handwriting. It was a script she knew as well as her own. The note was small, the paper softened and frayed from years of being folded and refolded, but the handwriting was an undeniable, gut-wrenching ghost from her past. It was her own, The elegant, looping script she used for everything from grocery lists to love letters. Eleanor's vision blurred as the words swam before her eyes. "My name is Daniel. If I am lost, please call my mommy, Eleanor." Below it was a phone number, a number she hadn't used in almost a decade. This was the note she had tucked into her son's jacket pocket on the day of the street fair, a simple precaution that had become a relic of her greatest failure. A wave of vertigo washed over her, and she gripped the wall for support. The hospital corridor, with its sterile scent and humming lights, dissolved into a chaotic memory of music and laughter, a day that had started with sunshine and ended in an endless, silent scream. She was transported back to that vibrant, crowded street fair, the air thick with the sweet smell of spun sugar and the cheerful music of a nearby carousel. Daniel, her Daniel, was tugging at her hand, his eyes wide with wonder at the kaleidoscope of colors and sounds. For a single, fleeting moment, she had turned away, her attention caught by a stall selling handmade silver necklaces. It couldn't have been more than 30 seconds, but when she turned back, smiling, ready to ask him which one he liked best, the space where he stood was empty. The world tilted on its axis. A frantic search began, her calls of his name swallowed by the indifferent joy of the crowd. The cheerful music became a mocking, nightmarish soundtrack to the dawning horror that her world had just been irrevocably shattered by one moment of inattention. The days that followed were a blur of unimaginable pain, a suffocating fog of police stations, tearful interviews, and the hollow, clinical questions of strangers. She walked the city streets for weeks, plastering posters with Daniel's smiling, innocent face onto every telephone pole and storefront window, his image becoming a symbol of a hope that dwindled with each passing sunset. The secret she carried was the crushing weight of her own guilt, a silent, internal torment that convinced her she was solely to blame. Friends offered condolences for her loss, but they didn't understand. Daniel wasn't just lost. He had vanished, leaving a void of unanswered questions. This lack of closure was a unique kind of torture, a wound that could never scar over because she was forever trapped in the moment he disappeared, endlessly replaying her mistake. Back in the fluorescent glare of the hospital corridor, Elena held the crumpled note out to Sarah, her hand trembling violently. This was my son's," she managed to say, her voice cracking with a decade of unshed tears. "His name was Daniel. He disappeared 8 years ago." Sarah's compassionate face grew pale as she looked from the note to Elena's grief-stricken expression. She took a deep breath, her own voice dropping to a near whisper as she revealed a critical piece of Leo's hidden past. "Leo was found 3 years ago," she explained gently. "He was wandering alone near the old St. Jude's orphanage just after the fire. He had no memory of his life before that, no records, no name. This note, this was the only thing he had. The orphanage, a place of forgotten children, now held a terrifying new significance. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered before her, forming a picture that was both impossible and undeniable. The boy in the hospital bed was not Daniel, yet he carried her son's final message, a tangible piece of her lost history, the portrait she had painted. The face that had haunted her from a sunlit park was no longer just an echo of her grief. It was a beacon, a cosmic signpost guiding her toward a truth she never knew existed. Her mission had suddenly changed. It was no longer about healing her own past, but about uncovering Leo's. She had to understand the journey of this small, fragile piece of paper, and how it connected her lost child to this lonely one. But as she gazed toward Leo's room with a new, fierce determination, she couldn't possibly know that this path would lead her to a truth more shattering than she could ever imagine. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Elena found herself standing before the skeletal remains of the St. Jude's orphanage. The structure was a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple sky, a monument to forgotten stories and abrupt endings. The air was thick with the scent of damp ash and wild, overgrown weeds that climbed the charred stone walls. She walked the perimeter of the chain-link fence, her fingers tracing the cold metal, feeling an inexplicable connection to this place of profound loss. This was where the trail of her son's note had ended, and where Leo's story had begun. A small, neatly kept cottage stood on the adjacent property, its windows like tired eyes watching over the ruins. A light was on inside. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, Elena pushed open the small gate and walked up the stone path, compelled by an instinct she couldn't explain. An elderly woman with eyes as clear and sorrowful as a winter sky answered the door. She introduced herself as Sister Agnes, the former director of the orphanage. When Elena, her voice trembling, showed her the photograph of the portrait she had painted, the woman's composure fractured. A look of pained recognition washed over her face, her hand flying to her mouth. But it wasn't just the boy in the picture she recognized. Her gaze lifted to Elena's face, and a new layer of understanding dawned in her eyes. You are the mother from the posters," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing. "The boy who disappeared at the fair all those years ago. Daniel." She stepped back, gesturing for Elena to come inside. Away from the ghosts of the past that lingered in the twilight air, the small living room was filled with a solemn silence, a prelude to a story that had waited years to be told. Sister Agnes sat Elena down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and began to speak of a time after the posters had faded and the news stories had ceased. She told of an older boy, about 10 years old, who had shown up on their doorstep one night, cold, hungry, and fiercely independent. He refused to give his name, only saying he was on his own. He was quiet but incredibly kind, especially to the younger children. He took a special liking to a small, timid 6-year-old named Leo, who had arrived just a month before. The two were inseparable, their resemblance so striking that the other children often joked they were secret brothers. As Elena listened, a cold dread coiled in her stomach. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the nameless, protective older boy was her Daniel, somehow finding his way here after all this time. The story then turned to the night of the fire, and Sister Agnes's voice dropped to a near inaudible whisper. She described the panic, the acrid smoke, and the terrifying roar of the flames. In the midst of the chaos, the older boy had been a beacon of courage, guiding a group of younger children, including Leo, through a back window to safety. Outside, in the cold, chaotic darkness, he saw how much Leo was shivering. Without a moment's hesitation, he took off his own worn jacket and wrapped it snugly around the smaller boy's shoulders. He told him to be brave. Then, hearing a faint cry from inside, he turned and, before anyone could stop him, ran back into the burning building. It was the last time anyone ever saw him. The world around Elena dissolved into a silent, colorless void. The jacket, the note, it was Daniel's. The truth did not arrive gently. It shattered the very foundation of Elena's reality. For 8 agonizing years, she had been the mother of a lost boy, a victim of a cruel, random tragedy. In one devastating moment, that identity was obliterated. She was now the mother of a hero. Her son had not simply vanished. He had lived, he had cared for another, and he had made the ultimate sacrifice in an act of breathtaking courage. The guilt she had carried for so long, the weight of that single distracted moment at the fair, was replaced by a new, complex grief, one shot through with a fierce, heartbreaking pride. Leo was not her son, but he was her son's living legacy, the boy for whom Daniel had given everything. Her world had not just been turned upside down, it had been remade in the image of his final, selfless love. The immediate aftermath of the revelation was not a storm of tears, but a quiet, chilling calm Elena drove back to the hospital in a daze, the world outside her car window a muted, colorless film. When she entered Leo's room, the boy's face lit up with a hopeful smile. But it faltered when he saw her expression. She was a stranger. The warmth that had previously radiated from her was gone, replaced by a polite, impenetrable distance. She sat in the chair by his bed, but she didn't take out her sketchbook. She simply watched him. And in his hazel eyes, she no longer saw a boy in need of a mother, but a living, breathing testament to her own son's death. Every beat of the heart monitor was a painful echo of the heart that had stopped beating in a burning building, all for the child sitting in front of her. The connection they had forged felt like a cruel deception, and the silence between them was no longer a comfort, but a crushing weight. Leo, with the keen intuition of a child who has known too much uncertainty, sensed the shift immediately. He saw the coldness in her gaze, the rigid set of her shoulders, and the way her hands remained clasped tightly in her own lap, never reaching for his. "Are you mad at me?" he asked, his voice small and trembling, laced with the familiar fear of abandonment. The question pierced through Eleanor's numbness, but she couldn't find the words to answer. How could she explain that her heart was breaking not because of him, but for him and for the son she had lost twice over? A bitter wave of resentment washed over her, not for Leo, but for the universe itself. It felt like a cosmic bait and switch, offering her a path to healing only to reveal it was paved with the ashes of her deepest tragedy. She felt profoundly wronged, as if her grief was a game being played by a cruel, unseen hand. Sarah found her later, standing in a deserted hospital lounge, staring out at the rain-streaked city lights. The nurse spoke softly of Daniel's incredible bravery, of the profound legacy of love he had left behind. But Elena's pride had hardened into a brittle shield. Her private, sacred grief had been stolen from her, repackaged as an inspirational story for others to consume. "He was my little boy," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He shouldn't have had to be a hero. He should be here." She felt a deep, cutting humiliation. She had approached Leo with the pure intention of offering kindness, of filling a void. Now, that gesture felt transactional, as if she were being asked to accept him as a replacement, a living debt she was now expected to pay. This wasn't the connection she had sought. It was a lifelong obligation, a constant reminder of what she could never have back. The following day, Elena did not go to the hospital. She retreated to the one place she felt she could control, her studio, but the sanctuary had become a prison. She stood before the portrait of Leo, her creation, and felt a profound sense of betrayal. The painting was no longer a bridge to hope. It was a monument to a devastating misunderstanding. The face that stared back at her was a composite ghost, a haunting fusion of the son she had lost and the child she now felt incapable of facing. The very act of creation, which had once been her solace, now felt like a source of torment. Every brushstroke seemed to mock her, a reminder of the naive hope she had allowed herself to feel. To embrace Leo would mean fully accepting Daniel's death, and that final, absolute truth was a chasm she was terrified to cross. A week passed in a blur of silent, agonizing days. At the hospital, Leo grew quiet, his brief spark of hope extinguished. He stopped asking the nurses when Elena would return. His small face often turned towards the window in quiet resignation. Sarah called Elena, her voice gentle but firm with concern. "He's not eating much," she said. "He thinks you're not coming back. He thinks he did something wrong." The words were like shards of glass in Elena's heart. She was trapped in an impossible conflict. Her own pain screamed at her to build walls, to protect herself from any further devastation. Yet, the memory of her son's selfless final act, and the image of a lonely little boy waiting for a promise to be kept, tore at her conscience. Could she truly turn her back on Daniel's last gift to the world? The question echoed in the desolate silence of her studio, demanding an answer she didn't have. The silence in her studio was no longer a comfort, but an accusation. For days, Eleanor had walled herself in with her grief, letting the ghost of her son eclipse the needs of a living child. Sarah's words echoed relentlessly. "He thinks he did something wrong." She looked at the portrait, at the hazel eyes that held both Daniel's memory and Leo's present loneliness. A profound realization washed over her, a wave of shame so powerful it brought her to her knees. Her son, her brave, selfless Daniel, had run into a fire to save this boy, and she, in her pain, had run away from him. By rejecting Leo, she was desecrating the very last act of love her son had offered the world. She was allowing her grief to tarnish his legacy. The pain didn't vanish, but it shifted, making room for a new, urgent purpose. She had to honor her son not by mourning what was lost, but by cherishing what he had saved. The drive back to the hospital felt different. The city, which had seemed grey and hostile just hours before, was now washed in the soft, tentative light of a clearing sky. Elena walked down the long, sterile corridor, her footsteps no longer hesitant, but filled with a quiet, determined resolve. She was not returning to the scene of her trauma. She was returning to fulfill a promise she hadn't known she'd made. The promise was in Daniel's final act, in the crumpled note, in the uncanny resemblance that had drawn her to a boy in a park. It was a promise to carry forward the love that had been so cruelly taken from her. She stopped outside Leo's door, her heart aching not with fear, but with a deep, maternal yearning to mend the hurt she had caused. She took a deep breath, pushing the door open to let the light spill into the room. Leo was sitting up in bed, listlessly pushing food around on his tray, his small shoulders slumped in defeat. He didn't look up when she entered. Elena's heart broke at the sight. She pulled the chair close to his bed and waited until his gaze finally, cautiously met hers. "Leo," she began, her voice thick with unshed tears, "I am so sorry. I had to go away for a little while because I was feeling a very big sadness, but my sadness had nothing to do with you. It was not your fault. Not ever." She reached into her bag and pulled out her sketchbook and a piece of charcoal. She opened it to a clean page and, with a trembling hand, began to draw the outline of a magnificent ship with tall masts and full sails. A vessel strong enough to weather any storm. As she sketched, she began to tell him a story, her voice soft but steady. She told him about another boy, a brave and kind boy named Daniel, who also had hazel eyes and a smile that could light up a room. She explained that Daniel had been lost a long time ago. Then she carefully unfolded the crumpled note and showed it to him. "This was his," she said gently, "the night of the fire. He gave you his jacket to keep you warm, and this note was inside. He wanted to make sure you were safe. He was your hero, Leo." The little boy looked from the note to her face, his eyes wide with a dawning understanding. He wasn't just a lost boy. He was part of a story of incredible courage and love. The truth, finally spoken, settled between them not as a weight, but as a gentle, healing light. Leo reached out his small hand and placed it over hers, his fingers curling around the charcoal stick. His touch was no longer a painful echo of the past, but a tangible link to the future. He looked at the drawing of the ship and then back at Elena, a fragile, hopeful smile finally returning to his lips. "Can you draw him on the boat with me?" he whispered. Tears streamed down Elena's face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of gratitude, of a love that had found its way home. Yes," she whispered back, squeezing his hand. "Yes, I can." In that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines, a mother's heart began to heal, not by replacing what was lost, but by making room for a new and beautiful chapter, one built from the ashes of tragedy and the enduring power of a hero's love. The seasons turned, and the grey, rain-soaked afternoon that had brought Sarah into Elena's gallery became a distant memory, replaced by a succession of sun-drenched mornings. The art studio, once a solemn cathedral of grief, was now filled with the bright, chaotic energy of a young boy. Small canvases covered in vibrant, joyful finger paints stood beside Elena's more refined works, and the scent of oil paint was now mingled with the sweet smell of pancake breakfasts. Leo's laughter echoed off the high ceilings, a sound that had chased away the last of the shadows. Elena's hands, once stained with the somber blues and browns of her sorrow, were now often dotted with the primary colors of a child's world. She had discovered that a heart, no matter how broken, possessed an infinite capacity to expand, making room for new love without diminishing the old. Their life was a quiet masterpiece, composed not of perfect strokes but of messy, beautiful, everyday moments. For it is a profound truth of the human heart that sometimes our deepest pain is not a prison, but a bridge to someone else's healing. Elena had believed her art was an ending, a final, beautiful tombstone for her grief. She never imagined it was a beginning, a lighthouse built from her tears to guide a lost little boy safely to shore. The portrait of Leo was more than just paint on canvas. It was a prayer made visible, an unconscious call sent out into the universe that was answered in the most miraculous way. Her love for Daniel, a force so powerful it had to go somewhere, had traveled through time and tragedy to find its new purpose. It had woven a thread through a lost note, a selfless act of heroism, and a chance encounter, proving that love, like energy, is never truly destroyed. It only changes form. One quiet evening, they sat together on the sofa, a worn photo album open on their laps. Eleanor pointed to a picture of a small boy with familiar hazel eyes, grinning from a swing set. This was Daniel," she said, her voice soft and steady, no longer cracking with pain but warm with love. "He was so brave and so kind. He would have loved you very much." Leo traced the smiling face with his small finger, his expression one of reverence and understanding. He wasn't looking at a rival for his mother's affection, but at the big brother he never knew he had, the hero of his own story. In sharing Daniel's memory, Elena wasn't dividing her heart. She was making it whole. She was a mother to both her sons, one a guiding star in the heavens, the other a warm, vibrant sun right beside her. The world is woven together by invisible threads of connection, by gestures of kindness that ripple outward in ways we can never predict. A young boy's selfless act of giving his jacket to a shivering child in the dark did more than save him from the cold. It preserved a link to a past that would, years later, create a future for them both. It is a powerful reminder that no act of love, no matter how small, is ever wasted. If this story of a bond forged in loss and redeemed by courage has moved you, consider sharing it as a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. It may be the very message of hope someone in your life needs to see today, a sign that even after the most devastating storms, the sun will find a way to shine again. They stood together in that same sun-drenched park, the place where Elena's journey back to life had unknowingly begun. The late afternoon light cast long, golden shadows on the grass. Leo was chasing pigeons, his laughter a bright, clear sound that no longer pierced Elena's soul with sorrow, but filled it with an overwhelming sense of peace. She watched him, not as a grieving woman seeing a ghost, but as a mother watching her son, her heart full to bursting. He ran back to her, slipping his small hand into hers. As they turned to walk home, the setting sun illuminated their faces, and on Elena's there was a smile of pure, unburdened joy. The portrait was no longer needed on a gallery wall. The true art was here in this simple, perfect moment, a new family walking hand in hand into the light.